Hello, I'm Sandra Kaplan, and it's my pleasure to present this training video on the APTA CAT EI, or the Critical Appraisal Tool for Experimental Intervention Studies. This tool was developed in collaboration with Christine McDonough and Matt Elrod, the latter of whom was on APTA staff in the Department of Practice at the time. Some disclosures. I do receive honoraria from APTA to provide training on guideline development, but did not receive any honoraria for the development of this tool, nor for this training video. I am the lead investigator on the study to establish psychometrics for the CAT EI, and will be presenting that data as part of the support for its use. So the benefits of using critical appraisal tools or checklists to review research literature is that it provides more reliable process than informal appraisal processes. When we use a checklist, our appraisals are more structured, they're standardized across appraisers, and the responses to conditions are more straightforward. When the CATs are developed or based on empirical verified criteria, it can improve our focus on the risks of bias. And it improves communication among the raters on a guideline development team by providing a common taxonomy of language, the same metrics to review the same types of research designs, and that allows for easier comparison across articles. Overall, the CATs can help to improve our critical thinking about the usefulness of those studies to the question we're trying to answer. There are challenges to using critical appraisal tools. There are a lot of instruments out there, but most lack standardization. And when comparing tools, there can be a lot of variability across the tools in terms of the items that they include. Often they are consensus products and thus lack reliability and validity, although there are more and more attempts to subject some of these tools to psychometric testing. The tool may or may not be applicable to your field or your patient population. And there are different quality rating analyses obtained if you use different tools on the same journal article or on the same research study. You might actually get different assessments of the quality because of the way the tools are structured. Lastly, we need to appraise the individual outcome measures within studies. And as far as we know, we could, at the time, could not find a tool that would allow us to do that. When evidence-based practice first was presented and we were thinking in terms of levels of evidence, the charts that were provided, primarily through McMaster and the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, had us looking at just the design. So systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials that were well conducted would rate a level 1 evidence. And level 2 might be poorly conducted, randomized controlled trials, or maybe not poorly conducted, but maybe they were underpowered, or they had a few other areas of risk of bias that would drop them out of the level 1. Maybe it was a cohort study, which was not deemed as rigorous in demonstrating cause and effect as a controlled trial. So that would be a level 2. Outcome studies were level 3 because there was no control group. So based on the design of the study, we would assign a level. But that's changed. We really need to be thinking in terms of the individual outcome within that study. And when there are multiple outcomes in a single study, we need to assess those outcomes separately. So we now need to think about not just the design, because that does add to the rigor of and our confidence of a cause and effect relationship, but we also need to look at the integrity of the outcome measure and how it was handled. And so when we look at that outcome measure through multiple studies, if it's conducted, if the measurement is conducted the same way, and the testers are using it the same way, we can summate the impact of interventions on that outcome across multiple articles. But what happens when we have several outcomes in a single study and one outcome has high or strong reliability and validity? Maybe our second outcome has only modest validity and reliability. And maybe the third outcome measure was something that was developed by the researchers and hadn't yet been subjected to psychometric analysis. So no reliability and possibly questionable validity. When we look at assigning a level of evidence, our first outcome that has strong reliability and validity in an experimental design should rate a higher level of evidence than our third measurement that had questionable validity and no established reliability. And yet it's in an experimental study. So we want you to be thinking more in terms of the integrity of the outcome measures within the design and not just assigning level of evidence because of the design. This is also especially true when you look at a systematic review that may have been based on randomized controlled trials. But if the quality of the randomized controlled trials were all level 2, should we be giving a well conducted systematic review level 1 evidence when it's concluding that the level 2 evidence that it reviewed may have an influence in one direction or another? So always need to go back to that specific outcome. That's the bottom line. So our goal as a team was to think about developing a tool that would appraise the risk of bias in experimental intervention studies, that would appraise the rigor of multiple outcome measures within the same tool, would have language that was rehabilitation friendly, and could be used by the guideline development groups, by individual clinicians who want to review an article, and possibly by educators who are teaching the process of critical appraisal. Just a brief history then behind this CAT EI. We began training clinical practice guideline groups in the summer of 2012. And at that first training workshop, there were at least a half a dozen, maybe more groups. And the question posed to us as presenters was, why can't we have a single critical appraisal form recommended that we should all be using? And at the time, different groups were using different appraisal forms for experimental studies. And we really didn't have a good reason to promote any one tool over another. We decided to explore the options for finding one to adopt or adapt. Megan Smith, the librarian for APTA, compiled 21 tools from the literature and from tools that many of us knew about that we shared with her. And we put that into a spreadsheet of the tools by the types of criteria used in the risk of bias analysis. Matt Elrod, Christine McDonough, Courtney Hall, Susan Herdman, and Rita Wong and myself went through these different tools and the language that was used in each of their questions and came to consensus that none of the tools actually reflected all of the issues we felt were important in language that was neutral or inclusive of rehabilitation clinicians. And so we decided to create our own tool, which was finalized by 2014 by selecting the items to appraise, coming to agreement on the wording and which items, and laying that out in a form that would allow us to move through the appraisal process with some level of efficiency. In 2014-15 is when we did the study to look at the validity and intertester reliability of the form that was developed. In phase 1 of that study, we had volunteers reading 2 articles and completing the CAT EI on each article. They sent those back to us, and we compared their responses against a key that we had collectively identified as what we thought were the correct answers. and looked at the areas, the questions that had the most discrepancies. They also did a rating of each item as to its clarity and whether it should actually be included in the tool. Um, and so in phase two, we did an analysis of the revisions. Phase two, we looked at having people reread one or the other article. There was a 3-month gap between the two readings. They sent their information back, and we looked at their ratings again on clarity and usefulness of the items. So in the first phase, you can see that 73% of the participants felt that the items overall were clear. 14% of the items were seen as somewhat clear. And there was pretty much agreement, 77% felt overall the items to include them in the tool. And there were some that they were neutral about. We did make revisions, and on the second phase, our clarity went up a little bit and our inclusiveness went up a little bit. But overall, we felt that the vast majority felt that the items were clear and that they should be included. In terms of the actual reliability measures, when looking at it on a single measure item, so question by question, was a little bit lower in the first phase. In the second phase, we were at 0.8 for each of those. But when you looked at the overall tool reliability, averaging all of the questions, we were pretty high to begin with, and we retained that strength at the end. So we're pretty confident that if you follow the directions and the scoring or rating operational definitions, that cross raters, you should be quite strong, somewhere perhaps between the 0.8 and 0.98 level. There are caveats to using any critical appraisal tool, including this CAT EI. You can only judge what's been written in the article. And we know that because of publication limits, word limits, sometimes some things are just left out of method sections. So when it's not there, an article might get downgraded or not given credit for having done something that may actually have occurred, but we wouldn't know that from the way it was described in the article. Each of the articles that you evaluate on risk of bias are equally weighted in these tools, but that doesn't mean that they should be equally weighted in terms of their contribution to bias in the study that you're reading. And in one study, one item might be a fatal flaw, where it might not be a fatal flaw in another study. We don't understand bias thresholds. How much bias is enough or too much? Maybe when the intervention affects life or death, we'd want a higher threshold for bias. But if it's exercise in healthy subjects, maybe we're okay with a slightly lower threshold. How much is too low? We don't know. All we do know is that as guideline groups or journal clubs or clinicians who are looking to apply evidence into practice, the decision should be transparent about where the risk of bias is and whether that's important to include or not. The overall design of the CAT EI has an introductory set of pages, and then there are 3 sections to the actual tool. The first A section is about the study question and its design. The B section is separated into 2 parts. Questions 1 through 12 deal with the risk of bias in the study design itself. And questions 13 to 20 look at the risk of bias associated with individual outcome measures. The third portion, part C, gives you an opportunity with questions to think about the impact or relevance of the study. On the tool, we put sections A and C in gray boxes because They provide context, but they're not actually part of the rating of the risk of bias. It helps to have both parts there when you're teaching people how to critically appraise an article. And the second portion, or part C rather, kind of closes the loop on the process that we use when we ask a question, we read an article, we need to finally make that decision as to whether to apply that article in practice or not. We hope that the tool is designed in a way that it facilitates teaching of the critical appraisal process. And for those who are using it for systematic reviews in their clinical practice guidelines, the tool is available as a fillable PDF. And if you have Acrobat Pro, I believe, you can set that up so that you can export the fields into a spreadsheet by linking the two. So let's take a closer look at the tool itself. As I mentioned in the first 3 pages of the packet, the first page is an introduction to the tool, but the second and third pages are the actual rating explanations. So you'll see that for question B1, there are select yes if inclusion criteria are described in sufficient detail, and select no if the description lacks clarity. So for each question, there is a select yes and a select no option that helps you make a decision about how to score that particular item. At the top of the actual tool, you have a place where you can indicate whether you want to include this study in your systematic review. And you can circle the type of randomized controlled trial, quasi-experimental or single subject design, but these are all intervention study designs, and it just helps you identify what type it is. There is a place for the citation, so the title, author's journal, so that identifying information, as well as a place to indicate who the reviewer is for that article. There's a place to identify the PCAT question that was being answered by the article. The population, the intervention, the comparison intervention, the outcome measures, and the time frame. And again, these were inserted as a way to help students and clinicians dissect out the critical information. You can also identify where the study took place and indicate whether I or B approval is indicated in the article. So in the B section, the first portion has 12 questions that are related to how the study design was constructed. We ask about inclusion and exclusion criteria of the subjects, recruitment methods to minimize bias, whether a priori power analysis was conducted, whether participants were randomly assigned, whether allocation to the treatment group was concealed, whether there was a control group, blinding, were the interventions described in sufficient detail to replicate them? Was there adherence to the study protocol? Was there a presence or absence of adverse events? And were the conflicts of interest managed so that one has confidence in the results? And for each one of those questions, you would circle on the right whether it was reported adequately or not, right? And yes, it's a judgment call to some degree, but often it's pretty clear in the study or it's missing. And that's when it's pretty easy to make that differential choice. At the very bottom, you're going to tally up all the yeses that you were able to circle, and that will give you a partial tally for this first section on design. At the top of the second section of the B portion that looks at risk of bias, you have the opportunity to identify the outcomes of interest. In a study that has 8 outcomes, you might only be interested in 3 of them. And so you would identify what outcome 1, 2, and 3 are, and then you're going to rate outcome 1 in the column for outcome 1, Outcome 2 would be rated in its own column. And so you get individual outcome ratings for each of the outcomes of interest. You do have a place over here to put the type of measure that was used. So, for example, if they were looking at range of motion as an outcome, did they use an electrogoniometer as the type of measure? So this bottom section you'll see repeated on the next slide. Here are those 5 outcomes across the top. And this second section, questions 13 through 20, deal with the risk of bias of the outcome measures themselves. So was the measure of interest, did it have established validity and reliability? And was reliability of each tester reported for that outcome measure? Were the testers and data collectors blinded to the treatment groups? Were subjects analyzed in the groups to which they were assigned? Did sample size meet the requirements for power? For each outcome of interest, are the study groups equivalent at the baseline? And for each outcome, is the estimated effect size and its precision reported? You'll notice that in some of these boxes, we have a not applicable. So for example, was reliability level of the testers reported for each outcome of interest? Well, if this first outcome measure was a quality of life scale, maybe it's the SF-36, we know that it has established reliability and validity, so it would get yeses here. But you're just going to set that patient up, or they will have used it on their subjects by having them fill out a standardized test that gets scored a particular way. And if they did it as an online test, it gets scored automatically for them. So the testers in that study are not actually administering that outcome measure, that quality of life measure. And so it would be not applicable. Another example would be with regard to the power analysis. If in the first section, B section, for the question where we ask, was an a priori power analysis conducted? If they didn't conduct a power analysis before settling on the size of their treatment groups, then answering the question about whether they exceeded the power analysis requirements is not applicable. Again, you're going to have for each outcome a tally at the bottom, and then a chance to add the tally from the questions B1 through 12 from the front page. And those two numbers combined out of 20 will give you a sense of how much was reported adequately that you feel confident in the results of that study. So just below section B of those tallies, you can then say for outcome 1, this is a high quality study, an acceptable quality, low quality, or maybe it's unacceptable. And that will vary depending on that threshold for risk of bias that you feel is critical for the study or the questions that you're trying to answer. You can also use those tallies to rate against the levels of evidence definitions. So the Academy of Pediatric Physical Therapy uses these definitions, and we have a very modest level or threshold of a critical appraisal score that it has to have more than 50% of those items, or 10 out of 20 items reported in the study to even consider it at a level 1 evidence. And if it's less than 50% of the items, even if it's a randomized controlled trial, it is going to drop down to level 2. Right? So it gives us a little bit more guidance about how to assign a level of evidence to an outcome that might have been in a randomized controlled trial, but maybe there just wasn't enough reported about the methodology in that article, or in a referred article where they might have the full methodology explained, sometimes you have to go back and get that other article to understand the results of a second analysis of the data. But that's a way that you can use those tallies to consider where you're placing the level of evidence. Just remember that caveat at the bottom, that the items are not weighted for importance in the CAT EI, and therefore each article and the outcome measures need to be evaluated for which items weren't reported and whether those missing items really are critical in terms of the impact on your confidence in the results. Finally, in section C, you have questions like, is the conclusion justified? Were the limitations of the study reported? Could interventions be applied in usual practice? Are there cost considerations? And was the follow-up sufficiently long? And these questions will help you determine the relevance to practice, the impact, if you're looking at just, does this research article, should I use this in practice? These kinds of practical questions may make a difference. So in summary, the APTA CAT EI has both content validity and strong inter-tester reliability. It yields separate bias evaluations for each outcome of interest, and it provides explanations for, I think, the intermediate user who's familiar with research terminology and evidence-based methods in order to score it with some level of reliability. It is not a generic tool. It is only designed for experimental studies of 2 or more groups, but it does not need to be a randomized control trial. It can be a quasi-experimental and outcome study, or even a single subject design where there are 2 different phases of intervention being compared. So I've provided references for you for the usefulness and the challenges with CATs. And I thank you for your attention and your interest in using this tool. If you have any questions about the tool and how to use it, you can contact me at kaplansa@shp.rutgers.edu. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you, both in terms of your successes with it and if you have suggestions for its improvement.